During Fallout 4's development, Bethesda had grand plans for an entirely new kind of vault that had never been seen before. However, at some point in production, the entire area was scrapped, deleted, and almost lost forever. This is the untold tale of the underwater vault. There's a cut quest called 20 Leagues Under the Sea, and it would have primarily taken place in the Cut Vault 120. Its name is a reference to the novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne, a sci-fi classic where a marine biologist hunts down a mysterious sea creature that turns out to be a highly advanced submarine called the Nautilus. After being taken captive by the ship's captain, the biologist joins the submarine's crew on many adventures, most notably being attacked by a group of giant squid. In a Reddit post, Todd Howard revealed this cut vault also featured a similar creature, stating, "Unfortunate cut content, Bioshock-style vault with massive sentient octopus living outside it. The textures for this massive sentient octopus can still be found, and while it's unclear exactly how it would have looked, it undoubtedly would have been one of the most impressive abominations these games have ever featured." The animated icon for this quest exists as well, but very little else remains in Fallout 4's game files, as Bethesda was pretty thorough at deleting its unused content. Surprisingly, the cut cells for Vault 120 ended up appearing in Fallout 76, literally named Cut Unused Vault, and is likely present due to 76 being built off of its predecessor's files. Huge thanks to modder Ladlewade for backporting these files. This wouldn't have been possible without them, and they single-handedly made it possible for us to crack one of the greatest mysteries in the series' history. Thank you so much, my friend. The cut cells were never completed, and much is missing, including all dialogue and the main quest script, but by combining the unused content from both games and developer quotes, we have a pretty clear idea of how the quest would have played out.
Zhao, Captain of the Chinese Navy. I sail the Yangtze 31. This champion. This submarine. My beautiful boat.
Internally, 20 Leagues Under the Sea is called MS-03, and it seems it would have taken place directly after completing the quest Here There Be Monsters, which is named MS-02. During that side quest, the player helps Zhao repair the Yangtze Submarine. In the final game, Zhao mentions that he'll be sailing back to China after the quest is completed, but it seems that originally the player would have teamed up with him afterwards. It is possible that Here There Be Monsters was only made after Vault 120 was cut, and the shared assets were simply recycled, but evidence suggests the two quests were interlinked. Nevertheless, the player and Zhao would dive down to the depths of the Massachusetts Bay, likely in search of the vault, and trigger a submarine battle sequence. Not long after diving, enemy blips would start to appear on the ship's radar. These blips represented unmanned underwater vehicles, shortened to UUV in the code. I suspect they might have been pre-war military defenses used in case of communist invasion, but perhaps they were related to the Vault's defense system. The main quest script has an interesting note that comments, "Sonar ping 1, sonar ping 2, go to stealth mode, leads to torpedo event." The UUVs would begin to fire torpedoes at you, and there's a timer set up for evasive maneuvers, as well as some code for the player altering the sub's bearing and pitch, suggesting you could somehow dodge or perhaps lessen the effect of the UUV's attacks by avoiding a direct hit. There's some linked animations for this, but it's unclear what they would have looked like. A note mentions that the torpedoes will eventually kill the ship if the UUVs are not destroyed, which presumably would have resulted in the player dying and needing to reload their previous save. When a torpedo landed a hit on the sub, there would be varying degrees of camera shake and controller rumble, depending on the strength of the hit, ranging from weak, medium, or strong. Enemy torpedoes would damage the Yangtze in various ways, and it seems they would strike the ship in timed intervals. There's a quest stage for repairing the rudder, and it seems the player had to repair both the rudder and 3 phases of leaks to avoid the sub being destroyed. There's some leftover unused markers for the mess hall and crew quarters flooding, along with the cut water that would have filled them. Code suggests that the water level would rise and fall depending on the player's actions, accompanied by sounds to represent if the water was draining or rising. Apparently this code was copied over from Skyrim, most likely from the Thieves Guild quest where you get trapped inside a chamber of rising water. There's still a few unused terminals that would have been used to pump the water out of flooding rooms. They would have read, Yangtze Class Submarine Systems Interface, Alert Status, Major Flooding Detected, Alert Engineer Officer, Safety Protocol 1173, Bulkhead Lockdown in effect. Some bulkhead doors would be inaccessible due to flooding, and there would be a nearby yellow light to represent the door being locked. The player would have to pump the water out via a terminal submenu, and once the water had been completely drained, the light would change to green, representing the doors being open. The cut bulkhead subsystem menu would have read, Pumping in Progress. Please wait till sector has been cleared for entry. Bulkhead lockdown in effect due to sector flooding. Main pump is currently offline due to insufficient reactor output. Secondary pump is located in the reactor room. Another submenu would display how much flooding had occurred in the ballistic launch tubes, engine room, turbines, and the forward machine shop. There's also some code for the player loading torpedoes into torpedo tubes and firing them. The UUVs needed to be destroyed by the player with their own torpedoes, and they'd take 2 hits each to kill. The first shot you made couldn't miss, as a note mentions, player launched torpedo. First shot is always a hit. Each hit reduces the chance that the next shot is a hit. When hit, the UUVs on the sub's radar would play the white flash hit animation to indicate a target has been hit. It's unknown the exact order all of this would have taken place in, but perhaps the player had to alternate between repairing the ship and fighting off enemies. After successfully completing these objectives and killing your opponents, there would be a false failure sequence where the ship crashed into Vault 120. This crash might have been caused by an underwater mine, as code calls for an explosion sound for one.
Long ago, just after the fire, Yangtze struck our mine. My Qianting barely made it here into harbor.
Notably, Zhao mentions the vessel was initially damaged by an underwater mine, and this might have been intended to be foreshadowing for this moment. Intriguingly, some of the code also checks to see if Zhao has died, implying that he wouldn't have been an essential NPC. It's unknown how he could have died though, perhaps from the torpedoes or drowning due to the water levels, but there's nothing remaining to suggest what would have been the cause. Regardless of the exact reason for the crash, the submarine would now wreck into Vault 120's submarine docking bay. During the scene, the player's controls would be disabled, and the impact would be bolstered by strong camera shake and controller rumble. After crashing, the player and Zhao, presumably only if he survived, would be moved to a missing marker named DN158 Wake Up, suggesting you were knocked out from the impact of the wreck. This marker doesn't exist anymore, but I suspect the two of you would have woken up inside the now demolished submarine, potentially to the sounds of alarms blaring and water leaking into the torpedo room. The two of you would then escape the submarine via one of the vessel's torpedo tubes and enter the docking bay, which is partially flooded from the crash. Markers for this still exist, named Yangtze Emergency 120 to exit and Vault 120 Player Start marker. The torpedo tube is represented by a placeholder sewer cover, a common occurrence throughout these cells because the location was scrapped right after work on unique assets started. Notably, this would have been the first time the player was given a good view of the submarine, as it never completely surfaces in the final game, and is typically obscured by blur while underwater. The blocking of the submarine's placement is still very early, as parts of it are clipping through the walls of the vault. After arriving in the docking bay, the player and Zhao would abandon the submarine, moving through a trigger box that advanced the quest stage, then passing through the first of many airlocks. This would lead into a wide room with machinery, and from here you'd go up a flight of stairs to reach the vault's entrance, which overlooks the crash site. Nearing the entrance, the player would pass through another trigger that would advance the quest stage once more. A script suggests the player needed to use a terminal to open up the vault door, which would in turn advance the quest stage to 5. This implies that everything that had taken place up until this point was a part of the Here There Be Monsters quest, and the actual 20 Leagues Under the Sea quest would start as you open the vault door. The vault door itself is from Vault 111, and the adjacent screening area uses assets from Vault 114. Notably, there is an unused, untextured vault door that was seemingly going to appear somewhere inside the vault, but it was never placed. This asset would eventually be finished and recycled for nuclear missile silo doors in 76. The door that leads out of the screening area and further into the vault is called MS-03 First Door, and after passing through it, you'd reach a smaller room decorated with lockers. The path would now fork, and the player could either travel to a room that overlooks the submarine bay or further into the installation. If they chose the former, they'd be ambushed by an Assaultron, which appears to be the first of several jump scares that would have reinforced its inspiration from Bioshock. After defeating the robot or avoiding it, you'd reach a staircase that led down to a security room containing lockers, 10mm rounds, a security baton, and a safe. A destroyed hole in the wall of this room leads to a small maintenance room that likely would have contained various loot. From here, you'd go down another level into a residential area filled with rooms for the vault's inhabitants. You'd arrive first at a nursery area filled with cribs and a small playground. Beyond it are several rooms for the vault's population, complete with all the amenities you'd expect. The doorway leading further into the vault is blocked though, which would have made you travel through a series of residential rooms. Many of the rooms here are ravaged, while some entrances are barricaded, and it's possible there was a malfunction with the vault's automated security, causing these defense systems to attack the vault dwellers. The vault's overall condition suggests it was completely operational up until recently, and this catastrophe might have happened just before the player's arrival. After navigating the maze of bedrooms and showers, the sole survivor would arrive in a large, unfinished cave, which might have been submerged in water. There's 2 incomplete buildings here of an unknown purpose. The cave also contains a marker called MS-03 Temp-02, but its purpose is a mystery as well. It seems that after entering this area, a message would be displayed called MS-03 Hydroponics Message. This is linked to a cut entry called Institute Terminal Message that reads, Access Log, Notes, Routine diagnostic on Courser Designate X6-88, all functions nominal. More programming work on new AI software update. Prototype testing of neural net upgrades. This is the first time the Institute's involvement is hinted at, but we'll be returning to this idea several times throughout the video. This incomplete cavern leads to a small room where the player passed through a trigger advancing the quest stage, and then they would be force greeted by an unknown NPC. Inside this room, you'd encounter at least one character, though there may have been multiple survivors here. A marker in the same room implies the character that force greeted you was named James. Libertalia is pretty close to where this quest ends, suggesting that James Wire, a former Minuteman turned leader of a band of raiders, might be the James mentioned in Vault 120's markers. On the other hand, James Wire's internal ID implies he was never intended to be more than a raider boss, and I suspect that Vault 120's James was an entirely different character, a vault dweller who managed to survive the vault security system going haywire. It's possible he was even one of the vault scientists or somehow related to the Institute, but there's nothing remaining to support that theory. There's some chairs and 2 bedrolls here, suggesting that James likely would have had an AI routine where he moved around the room, using furniture and sleeping. There's another marker here called James Return Marker, implying the player had to complete some kind of objective before coming back here again. After talking to James, you'd return to the cavern, then head off to the right to travel further into the vault. Here you'd pass by 2 pools that likely contained aquatic life, and reach a door that has a marker beside it named MS03 First ID Scanner Marker 001, likely representing a terminal that checked your identity or security clearance. Perhaps you had to find the ID of a dead high-ranking scientist, hack the door, or maybe James would have opened it for you. The marker's name implies there would have been other ID scanners throughout the vault, but no others are present. This path would lead to a kitchen that connects to the vault's atrium, embellished by some communal dining tables. One of the doors leads to a walkway that spanned across the ocean floor and connected to another section of the vault, but it seems that it would have been initially inaccessible. A staircase leading up to the next level would funnel you into a sentry bot ambush attack, which might have been intended to be a jump scare. After defeating the sentry bot, you'd go up another flight of stairs and reach what appears to be an overseer's office, though as we'll see later in the video, the real overseer didn't use this office. Zhao would lean up against one of the walls here, as there's still an unused marker called MS03 Zhao Wall Lean. It's also numbered 03, implying he had leaned up against other walls before this point, but the other markers are missing. A door outside the Overseer's office is barely implemented, but it likely would have given you your first good look at the research facility on the other side of the plateau. From here you'd turn around, exit the Overseer's office, and head down a flight of stairs that brought you to an elevator named Vault 120 01 to 04. The elevator would take you down to the ground floor and exit into a substantial cavern filled with several large generators, which likely powered the whole vault. The cavern attaches to a room that has a set of T-51 power armor proudly displayed. Level-scaled versions of T-51 power armor spawn for players between level 14 and 20, suggesting the quest was intended for relatively low-level players. It's also possible this was simply a placeholder model, and has no bearing on how difficult it would have been. The official guide shows a cut, unique set of Institute power armor that looks like it was designed to withstand the intense pressure of the ocean floor. Its design is reminiscent of Big Daddy's armor in Bioshock, and might have been intended to be an homage to them. Either way, you'd equip it and pass into an airlock leading to the ocean floor through a door called Vault 120 02 to underwater. The player would now be warped to the Stellwagen Gorge cell, named after the real-world Stellwagen Bank, a giant underwater plateau in the Massachusetts Bay that has waters that are up to 600 feet deep. You would now exit the airlock and walk across the seafloor in power armor. The seafloor is entirely unfinished, but remaining props suggest it would have been covered in various rocks, seaweed, and man-made structures. After passing by several generators, the player would be given their first view of the vault's research station and the hallway that stretches across the gorge to the residential area where you initially crashed. Just beyond it, the wreckage of the Yangtze Submarine would be revealed in all its glory. Perhaps it would have been partially destroyed by torpedoes and underwater mines. It's too bad the model is never shown normally, as it's really well done, and this would have been an awesome moment, maybe one of the most memorable in the entire game. The player would now pass by a series of underwater structures that are so incomplete that it's difficult to speculate their purpose. Perhaps they would have contained fusion cores so the player could avoid drowning, or maybe even diver supplies like harpoons. Speaking of which, there's a cut Harpoon Gun in the base game, and its internal name links it to this quest as well. The Harpoon Gun would later appear in the Far Harbor DLC, but it uses an entirely different model than the cut one in the base game and looks vastly different. Perhaps this would have been the only weapon that would have functioned while underwater. It's unknown what enemies you would have fought while underwater, however. Maybe the unmanned underwater vehicles that attack the sub, synths, mirelurks, or perhaps small squid. The animated icon also shows a vault boy hiding from a mutated dolphin, so they might have appeared down here as well. This was a really cool idea, and it could have been awesome to fight off mutated sea creatures while marching around underwater in power armor. Underwater combat is a notoriously difficult form of gameplay to do well though, and it's possible this is part of the reason the vault never saw the light of day. After searching these structures, you'd pass by the ruins of a collapsed staircase that once led up to the research station, before eventually reaching a cave system. The cave tunnel would initially be a narrow winding path, but it'd lead out to a larger underground chamber that might have hosted some hostile sea life. The path would become narrow again afterwards, then curve around, drawing you closer to the irradiated ruins of the Yangtze. The battle and subsequent crash had apparently damaged the ship's reactor, and the player would have to quickly pass under it to avoid dying, as there's a strong radiation hazard placed around it. Afterwards, the player would continue across the seafloor before reaching the research facility, the final cell of the quest. After passing through another airlock, you'd reach a small room containing a destroyed terminal, connected to a cavern that led to a steep staircase. Another staircase would pass by some windows that showed off the vault's residential area. This would feed into a larger room containing a bubble turret and 3 potential paths to choose from. Going up the stairs would lead to a small office with windows showing off the residential area once more. The door below it leads to the walkway that spans the gorge and connects back to the vault atrium you previously explored. Perhaps James and Zhao would have waited in the atrium for the player to walk around the ocean floor to unlock this entrance. You can see the crash sub from this walkway, and it amusingly uses a giant industrial silo as a placeholder, which was likely placed before the Yangtze's model was completed. The door on the opposite side of the room would lead towards the conclusion of the quest. This door would lead to a long hallway filled with machinery, posters, pipes, and debris. The next door leads to a staircase that descends into a partially flooded area, with mist hanging just above the water surface. Most of the doors on this level lead to bunk beds, showers, or bathrooms, which were likely housing for the vault's researchers. Code shows that the quest stage would be advanced twice, which likely would have been achieved through accessing terminals in different areas of the research station, which in turn would have displayed messages from the Overseer called MS-03 Temp Overseer Message 1 and 2. Both of these messages are sadly missing, but likely would have expanded on the vault's experiments or living conditions. You also needed to recover a password, as another script would advance the quest stage to 600 and show a message called MS-03 Temp Password Message, which is also missing. Some of the potential routes would lead to the main research area, where some experiments on fish apparently took place. The room is decorated with terminals, desks, picnic tables, and most notably, more defensive barricades. It's possible these set pieces represented the researchers' last stand against the robot attackers, and the room likely would have contained more enemies to fight. An adjacent room contains a small kitchen that has nothing notable inside it. 2 doors in the main research area lead up to the topmost level of the vault, but one has been barricaded, while the other seemingly would have been locked, as there's a terminal placed on the other side of it. This would have forced the player to travel through a hole in the nearby wall. Several additional holes and walls would continue to a tank of mutated dolphins that were being experimented on, but the tank somehow burst, flooding this entire section of the research facility. The next level up contains a maintenance room, more destroyed terminals, barricades, mysterious empty rooms that might have featured loot or enemies, an autopsy room, and a large cavern with pools for experimenting on dolphins. It's particularly interesting they were experimenting on dolphins, as a terminal entry found at the Institute reads, quote, "Synth Zoological Initiative Phase 2 Development Journal. Initial thoughts. What to create? We've engineered creatures that inhabit the sky and the land. The next logical step is a creature of the sea. The greatest challenge remains data collection. Accurate measurements, behavioral data, life cycle, habitat, etc. Might Nahant have something useful? Note to self, request that we allocate a scavenger team to that area. So which aquatic creatures make a good candidate? Start with size. Nothing too large, nothing too small. Most promising candidates. Genus Delphinus, genus Carcharinus. On-site habitat will be a logistical challenge. Expansion of bioscience likely necessary, including large water tank. Many logistical challenges to implement. Facilities division likely to oppose this. Have to pitch this as the first step in a broader plan. What else can go in the aquatic habitat? Can we grow food there? What other experiments could we do? Could we develop underwater synth models to carry out seabed salvage operations? Probably far-fetched. Need to work on this more. We'll table this journal for the time being. Focus on other priorities until I can come up with more reasons that will benefit from the aquatic habitat. Can still gather data in the meantime." Unquote. This note is one of the last in-game remnants of the quest, and further reinforces the Institute's involvement here. It's possible the Institute was behind all of the destruction found throughout the vault, and that they attacked the vault dwellers to take control of the research facility. Perhaps the Institute would have been one of the primary enemies throughout the quest. It's also possible that the strange, mutated sea life found throughout the world were the result of the Institute experimenting on dolphins and sharks, though they may simply be the result of radiation too. Now you'd be nearing the end of the quest, and would reach a door guarded by a pair of bubble turrets and potentially other enemies as well. Just beyond the turrets is a marker named James Ketchup, suggesting that James would have reappeared at this point, maybe after you killed off all the enemies. Thanks for the help, bro. Zhao seemingly would have been warped to this location as well, though it's possible he acted as a short-lived companion and helped you fight your way up to this point. Finally, the player, Zhao, and James would reach a large chamber that housed the giant sentient squid Todd Howard hinted at. The model for this squid was never completed and is represented by a placeholder model. The window that would display it is one of the only unique assets made for the vault that was actually placed, named Vault Squid Window. The squid played a very significant role, as character artist Christiane Meister revealed. There was an underwater vault where the Overseer was supposed to be this giant octopus/squid. The model was still in the creation kit, so some people found it and used it, I believe. I made the carousel horses in Fallout 76. You will note that one of them is a hippocampus with a giant squid eating the seahorse. Revenge of the Squid. Looking back at the texture of the squid, we can see some kind of white augmentation on its brain. The second squid texture is tantalizingly called machines, and seems to show some kind of armor that it would have had, or perhaps cybernetic enhancements that would have allowed it to control the vault, suggesting this might have been some kind of mechanical squid overseer. Perhaps Vault-Tech's nefarious experiments revolved around it ruling over the population here, and it's even possible it was the one who turned the robots hostile against the vault dwellers. As you walked up to the squid, you'd pass through a trigger that would advance the quest stage. Two markers, MS-03 James/Zhao at Overseer, imply the two of them would have been standing right behind you as you spoke to the squid. Notably, there are also 3 mysterious markers towards the entrance of the chamber that have no name, and it's completely unknown what they were meant for. There's some unused code that seemingly suggests the player could release the Squid Overseer from confinement, which would advance the quest stage yet again. Perhaps you had to choose between releasing the squid or keeping it trapped inside its tank. This is nothing more than speculation, but perhaps Zhao and James would have represented either choice, with each of them spouting the pros and cons of your decision. All of this reminds me of a quest in Mass Effect that centers around a very similar decision. It seems that at some point during this confrontation, MS-03 temp terminal message would be shown if the player had recovered the password that was mentioned earlier. It might have been related to freeing or killing the Squid Overseer, but this message was also either deleted or never made. After the conclusion of the quest, the player would enter another room that contains 3 escape pods, which would return the player, Zhao, and James to the surface. There's a marker here called Capsule Marker and some code that would advance the quest stage again, likely completing the quest and specifically mentioning the word escape. These escape pod placeholders are actually scaled down industrial silos that are floating in the air. Notably, there's some kit pieces disconnected from the main area, along with another one of these escape pods, and this seems to be a more complete version of how they would have actually been displayed. The room here also contains a staircase that descends into water, and perhaps the player could dive down and explore a bit. After entering the escape pods, they would fire up a tube into the ocean, spawning out in the Wasteland world space and having them resurface at an unused marker called MS-03 Resurface Marker. This marker is placed in between the Yangtze, Shamrock Tap House, and the Harbor Master Hotel. This is almost definitely a placeholder that was nowhere near the vault's actual location, as the water is extremely shallow here and it's right near the city, which wouldn't have been a very inconspicuous hiding place. Instead, I suspect you'd actually resurface in the water south of Nahant, arriving at an unnamed cell not far from Nordhagen Beach, as there's some disabled escape pods there. There's 3 escape pods inside Vault 120, but intriguingly only 2 of them are placed on the beach in the Wasteland world space. It's possible that only Zhao or James would return depending on your choices, or perhaps they would have added a 3rd escape pod once the scene was completed. Unlike the vast majority of locations in-game, you seemingly wouldn't have had the option to return to Vault 120, as the Yangtze Submarine was left inoperable.
Welcome to the Nahant Oceanological Society.
It seems likely that Vault 120 was located somewhere south of Nahant, as Nahant is also mentioned in the Institute terminal message we looked at earlier. The Nahant location is linked to a group of pre-war civilians dedicated to preserving aquatic life, and they founded the Nahant Oceanological Society. I suspect this location was somehow involved too, even if that would have been limited to some terminal entry foreshadowing, but there's nothing linking them together, so that's just a guess. It's possible the townspeople were the original vault dwellers brought to Vault 120 when the Great War occurred. Notes mention they were already researching the long-term effects of radiation on aquatic life, which would have made them perfect candidates for Vault 120's projects. Supporting this theory, there's a building right outside the Oceanological Society that has a water tower, and a pipe from it runs very far underwater to the south, connecting to several strange structures that might have been related to Vault 120. The pipes run into an area where the real-world Gorge runs as well, further supporting this theory, but despite that, we don't have any concrete information, and this is all speculation. The player almost certainly would have been able to bring the unique set of Institute power armor out of the vault, and it'd be a waste if it was only useful in a single location. There are countless props placed throughout underwater areas in the Wasteland, but very few of them contain reasons to actually justify exploring them. The Ocean Floor section of Vault 120 suggests that some underwater locations could be explored with a degree of visibility, and maybe they originally planned to include additional points of interest in these regions. This would have been an awesome addition that would have fleshed out the world map and added another layer of exploration. In the end, I can't say I'm surprised this quest was cut, as it's easily one of the most ambitious in the entire game and easily more complex than any aspect of the main questline. Underwater combat, an intricate submarine battle sequence, and a giant animated squid overseer all would have been challenging and time-consuming to implement well. There are markers named MS-03, Playtest 6, 14, and 17, implying the area was playtested significantly and simply didn't work for one reason or another. Unfortunately, some elements of the quest will likely remain a mystery, short of another leak or an interview with one of the level or quest designers. In many ways, it reminds me of Fallout 3's cut Outcast questline, as we have a significant amount of information, but enough is missing that it almost leaves you with more questions than answers. Regardless of why it was cut and what remains unknown, 20 Leagues Under the Sea was a genuinely fascinating idea, and would have undoubtedly been one of the most memorable quests in the franchise's history. These changes would have made Fallout 4 into an even better game. Ultimately though, all of this was left on the cutting room floor.